Hello, everyone. I am Tilika Tripathi, Senior Program Officer at Columbia Global Centers, Mumbai. I am very pleased to welcome you to the program, Poetry of Crisis and Loss, a conversation with Sudeep Sen. With this, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Raveena Agarwal. Dr. Agarwal is the director of Columbia Global Centers, Mumbai. She is a socio-cultural anthropologist and was a tenured faculty member in the Department of Anthropology at Smith College. Her research is based on extensive fieldwork in the Himalayas. Prior to joining the center, Dr. Agarwal worked at the Ford Foundation's New Delhi office, where she was responsible for strategic planning and grant making for programs on education, media and information technology, and arts and culture. Dr. Agarwal is the author of several academic publications, and she has recently completed a mystery novel for young adults set in the Himalayas. With that, I will hand over the floor to Dr. Agarwal.
Thank you so much, Tulika, and welcome everybody. Living in exile at the cusp of the Second World War in 1939, the German playwright and poet Bertolt Brecht wrote these words that are often quoted in recent times. In the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. Poetry has seen a surge in popularity as we grapple with our chaotic and rapidly changing realities, whether climate change or the coronavirus pandemic. As with past calamities, artists and writers have risen to the occasion to offer us works that besiege us as a collective and offer moments of pause, reflection, healing, and hope. And people have shown their desire for such expressive forms. As the American Academy of Poets notes, readership of the website poets.org went up by over 100% between January 2020 and 2021. And virtual poetry readings and workshops mushroomed. Talking about this poetry wave, Joy Harjo, Poet Laureate of the United States, writes, "What often follows periods of decay and destruction and chaos is rebuilding and renaissance, periods of fresh invention in thought, in art." I am delighted to be in conversation today with Sudeep Sen, a writer, poet, literary editor, and alumnus of the Columbia Journalism School. Sudeep has edited influential anthologies, and his work has been translated into over 25 languages and appeared in publications such as Newsweek, Guardian, Observer, Independent, and a list of other publications, and has also been broadcast on the BBC, PBS, CNN, IBN, NDTV, and Doordarshan. He's the editorial director of Arc Arts, editor of Atlas, and currently the inaugural artist in residence at the Museo Camera in Gurgaon. He's the first Asian honored to deliver the Derek Walcott Lecture and has read at the Nobel Laureate Festival and been awarded the Senior Fellowship for Outstanding Persons in the Field of Culture Literature by the Government of India. Sudeep's prize-winning books include Postmarked India, New and Selected Poems, Rain Aria, and the most recent collection, Anthropocene, Climate Change, Contagion, Consolidation, published by Piparan. Welcome, Sudeep, and let me begin by discussing your latest collection, as this is Climate Week in New York City, and your book is called Anthropocene. So while this term Anthropocene was coined in the 1980s and popularized in 2000 by scientists Crutzen and Sturmer, the Indian historian Dipesh Chakravarti argues that this is the first geological period or epoch where humanists have actively been involved in debates around the timelines and definition. So Sudeep, why did you title your book as such, and what was the genesis of this book?
So first of all, it's a real thrill to be back in the Columbia fold. It's been a long time. I lived in New York primarily because first I was at Columbia, and then my first job was in the city itself. So it's lovely to be reacquainted and revisit Columbia albeit through the virtual portal, but it's lovely. And thank you, Raveena, for having me. Anthropocene, yes. I mean, there's so much been written about it now in the sphere of literary and sociocultural theory. The word Anthropocene or eco-criticism or eco-literature has become a new trend. Trends are problematic things, of course. But for me, climate change is something that I've been interested in for over 20 years. And it all started quite accidentally because, before that, before 20 years ago, we didn't actively think of climate change as something that we should be focusing on because we didn't see the ill effects of human degradation and the sort of destruction we have caused to society. So about 20 years ago, I chanced upon a journalist interviewing the president of Kiribati, which is a small island nation in the South Pacific. And he was asking him questions about the education policy and things like that. And he very quickly and very, very politely said that, we can talk about education policies and health policies, but actually my people are facing a much, much more traumatic future. Kiribati is made of 33 atolls, little islands. And the highest one is only 6.5 feet above the Pacific Ocean. And this I'm talking about 15, 16 years ago, Mm-hmm. So he said that the way the sea levels are rising because of climatic conditions and ice caps melting, Kiribati would be the first official nation to be underwater. He then proposed to the interviewer that, will you take us into your countries? What do we do with our people? Climate refugees. And it's such an astonishing thought that got me completely, going into this. And since then, I've been very, very kind of keenly following this whole, it's not even a movement, it's something that we are in. So yeah, so when you're surrounded by such a huge, huge thing, there is no other way but to confront it head on. And for me, it's through poetry, it's through fiction, it's through photography and through art. And the pandemic was the spur in a sense. And I consider the pandemic only as a subset of the larger climate change thing. So because we were in a lockdown, because of the situation of the pandemic, I had so much more time in a sense to think about it and engage with it and write about it and so on. So that's how it really began.
The writer, of course, Amitav Ghosh, in his book, The Great Derangement, he's argued that, literature has failed to understand and address the horror of global warming. And of course, Amitav has strongly endorsed your collection with the following words. I'm going to read them. Sudeep Sen's Anthropocene is an impassioned and heartfelt response to the intersecting planetary crisis of our time. It is of the utmost importance that more voices from the global south bear witness to the multiple catastrophes that are now unfolding around us. So do you think, Sudeep, that poets, and particularly poets in India, are increasingly responding to climate change? And if so, what themes and literary aesthetics do you see emerging from this engagement?
So I'll just back up a little bit. So yes, The Great Derangement, of course, had a huge influence, like it did with many, many people. And I think in a sense of his volume 2, called The Nutmeg's Curse, is coming out this month. It's not just geological and weather-oriented issue. It's a political issue, it's a human issue, it's an emotional issue. So, of course, artists in general, I think, respond very quickly to any catastrophe, any situation around, because they are just built that way. The DNA system in our bodies are such that we tend to be much more sensitive. In India, too, certainly if we were to scan the entire social media platforms, there's a huge, huge upsurge of poetry writing. I think Indian poets have written about the climate change and the pandemic in a kind of a sporadic way. So many of them have written a poem or 2 or 3 or 4 poems, but in a sustained fashion which sort of aggregates as a book, I don't think it has been done. So in a sense, my book sort of, is probably the first to, from a poetry point of view, to tackle that. So yes, so there's been a proliferation of poetry and poetry publications. Most of it is people just posting their thoughts and poem-like things on Facebook and Twitter and so on. But a couple of very important anthologies have come out. For instance, Singing in the Dark, takes its title from Brecht, which you beautifully read out before, which was published earlier this year by Penguin Random House. Really big, fat global anthology. Then there's another, For Your Eyes Only, which was edited by Raveena Agarwal. It's published by Habakal. These were two that came out fairly early, but there have been a host of other anthologies, online magazines, journals purely devoted to climate change. So yes, I mean, there's a huge, huge amount of activity. Yeah.
So, I mean, what kind of, would you say there's a certain style or an aesthetic that you're drawn to express what you do? And I would invite you to read your poem Disembodied, so that our audiences can hear it from you, and then perhaps discuss a little bit about the choices that you made, the aesthetic choices that you made as you wrote that.
I think Disembodied is a good poem to pick because it actually underpins a lot of things in the book, and stylistically, I'll talk about it once I've finished reading it. It's based very much in the city I'm speaking from, which is my home city of Delhi. So the locale is Delhi, but it's a very global poem. Disembodied. My body carved from abandoned bricks of a ruined temple, from minaret shards of an old mosque, from slate remnants of a medieval church apse, from soil tilled by my ancestors. My bones don't fit together correctly as they should. The searing ultraviolet light from Aurora Borealis patches and etch corrects my orientation. Magnetic pulses prove potent. My flesh sculpted from fruits of the tropics, blood from coconut water, skin colored by brown bark of Indian teak. My lungs fueled by Delhi's insidious toxic air, echo asthmatic sounds, a new vinyl dub remix. A universe where radiation germinates from human follies, where contamination persists from mistrust, where pleasures of sex are merely a sport, where everything is ambition, everything is desire, everything is nothing, nothing and everything. White light everywhere, but no one can recognize its hue. No one knows that there is color in it, all possible colors. Body worshipped not for its blessings, but its contours, artificial shape shaped by Nautilus, skin moistened by L'Oreal and not by season's first rains, skeleton strength not shaped by earthquakes or slow molded by fearless forest fires. Ice caps are rapidly melting, too fast to arrest glacial slide. In the near future, there will be no water left, or too much water that is undrinkable, excess water that will drown us all. Disembodied floats afloat like Noah's Ark. No GPS, no Polestar navigation, no fossil fuel to burn away. Just maps with empty grids and names of places that might exist. Already, there is too much traffic on the road. Unpeopled hollow metal shells without brakes swerve about, directionless, looking for an elusive compass. So yes, there's a lot going on there. And you asked me about aesthetics, and I'll first talk about a little bit about the architecture of the poem. The poem, as you see on the page, and you have the book, it's across 2 pages, and the lineation is very fragmented visually. And the reason I did that was because I wanted the fragmented nature of our world and the geological terrain, the way the tectonic plates shift, the way the ocean moves. I wanted to show the scattering of it all, the implosion and the explosion. Normally, I would actually gather unformed things and make it formal, but this one I consciously decided I'm going to just blow it apart, just because it just means something visually. Also, it's important because each phrase unit, phrase structures are so power-packed, so linguistically dense at one level that I wanted a lot of white space. So I wanted these floating atolls. We were talking about Kiribati, which of course macrocosmically have a beautiful geometric pattern like fractals. But when you go closer, it does look fragmented like icebergs. The book itself, again, because of the kind of varied nature of the way the world we are inhabiting, is a multi-genre book. So it's not just a regular poetry collection, but it also has flash fiction, it has micro-fiction, literary short stories, so to speak, but microfiction. It has meditation. It has a whole section of photography. And of course, normally in a poetry book, photography is very difficult to put in. I'm very, very particular about not bringing my photography into my poetry because that's side B of my life. And I want to keep both art forms pure and separate. But in this case, what happened was during the lockdown, the first part of the lockdown was very severe. So the only way we could sort of see the sky, and at least I'm privileged, I had a terrace, access to my terrace. And one of the things that was happening, of course, is, with mobile phones, one tends to capture photographs. And, suddenly you could see that the blue skies were returning to Delhi. The birds were back. You could actually hear them twittering because there were not that many cars. The air was so much more cleaner. So quite unconsciously, one of the things that I realized was I was photographing the same aspect ratio of 16:9 consistently every day, initially quite unknowingly, but then I said, okay, let me just follow it up. So there's this sort of outline of a tree and the skyscape at the back. And over a period of about 2 months, I realized I took, I don't know how many 100 photographs. There are only about 10 in the book. So it's a kind of a hybrid book. It's an unusual book in that sense, where it's sort of both poetry, ostensibly poetry, of course, but there's also fiction as well as commentary and photography and so on.
Okay, thank you. I invite everybody to take a look at the book because, Sudeep, as you describe it to us, it's one thing to hear it, which was also very beautiful, but another to also to see it and to see it across the page as you described it, and of course it's interesting to note how conscious, your choices were in the visual as well as the spoken or the heard, so very interesting. I'll turn to another looming crisis that humanity is grappling with these days, right? The pandemic. So what was your experience, Sudeep, writing during the pandemic?
I have to say that my life didn't really change much. I lead a very solitary life for, say, 18 hours of the day. I'm in the same room. In fact, it was quite a blessing because all the events one normally has to go to, sometimes willingly and unwilling, not willingly, they were all erased. So, one had so much more time to read and write. So in a sense, I got a lot of work done. The biggest frustration, of course, was, the cancellation of festivals and seminars and talks and so on, which in-person stuff, which meant no travel. And that can be very, very frustrating. So, but in many, many ways that I realized that, it's such a blessing to slow down. It's an odd kind of thing, anachronistic thing to say, but, at one level, there's all this devastation and horror outside, but one also embraced the quiet solitude and quietude and the calm. There's the horror and the beauty, but it's always like that, isn't it? It's the yin and the yang, the good and the bad, the life and the death, the churning.
Well, some of these emotions are captured in your poems. So will you read for us "Love in the Time of Corona," please?
Yeah, this one was a strange one in the sense that it wasn't a poem. Poetry normally is something that, something strikes you and you write it. So the editor of the Indian Express asked me to write something during the pandemic, for the editorial and op-ed pages. And he, of course, was probably thinking that I'll write a piece of nonfiction from an artist's point of view. I'm assuming that's what he, expected from me. Little did he know that his inbox will be landing this poem. And I have to say that he was very brave. He carried the poem as part of the newspaper. And he said, listen, that we've never carried poetry in our paper in this way. And that, because of the sheer volume of readership, both print and online, newspapers get read every day. And it traveled around the world. It got translated into about, 17 languages when I last counted it. A little film was made on it and so on. But let me read it out for you. Of course, it was written early days of the pandemic when the migrant workers were going and so on. So it's time-stamped in that sense. It opens with two quotations, epigraphs, Love in the Time of Corona. And the first one is from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, from the novel Love in the Time of Cholera. And I quote, I don't believe in God, but I'm afraid of him. And the other quote, of course, you beautifully read out is the Bertolt Brecht one. In the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. Faint indigo tints in the grays of your hair evoke memory. Krishna's love for Radha, its perennial longevity, its sustained mythology, its blue-bathed lore. Such are life's enduring parallels. 14 years, yet my heart flutters infatuated like first love. My hands fidgety, palms sweaty, pulse too fast to pick. I'm not allowed to touch your face. Cyber flurry emoji love cannot assuage fears or Corona's comatose cries. I don't believe in God. In thousands, migrant workers march home. Hungry footsteps on empty highways accentuate an irony. Social distancing, a privilege only powerful can afford. Cretins spray bleach on unprotected poor, clap, bang plates, ring bells, blow conches, light fires to rid the voodoo. Karuna's karma infected. Mood swings and sanitized quarantine, self-isolation imposed, uncontained virus viral. When shall we sing our dreams' epiphanies? City weather fluctuates promiscuously, mapping temperatures by polar graph. Tropics air conditioner chill, winters unseasonal hailstorm, skies pink blue spring. Blue-gray will mold into salt and pepper, ash-gray to silver white, and then to aged white. My lungs heave, slow grating metallic crackles struggle to escape the filigreed windpipes. I persist in my prayers. I'm afraid of him. Hope, heed, heal, our song in present tense.
Thank you, Sudeep. I mean, would you give us a little bit of more of a background as to what prompted you to express yourself, and particularly when you bring up the migrant workers, the tragedy of the moment. Could you elaborate on that some more?
So, when you have to write an article or when you see images on the television screen, and Columbia Journalism School, as a journalist, you report in a particular way. So reportage is important because it gives you the non-fictional aspects of a story. And that too, often it's a particular reporter's point of view. I mean, of course, everybody wants to give an unbiased story, but what about the actual inner emotions? The penumbra of all our mindscape. A friend of mine who is the group photo editor of India Today, he went out and shot some of these migrant workers. And I think during that time, there was a photo essay in India Today, all in black and white, just the faces of the people and details of the hands and so on. It was just no captions, nothing, just the photographs. It was poetry, really. So, when you're writing poetry, I mean, you try and bring in the other side of the picture, which is the human, the quiet, the subtonal frequencies, because the screams you can hear, the blood on the skin you can see, the calluses on the feet you can see, but pain you can't see, because we are very good at masking. And mask, of course, is such an important metaphor. Even before the pandemic, we are so masked because we are trained in a way to perform publicly in a particular way, privately in a particular way. So yeah, it talks about various things. Of course, the immediate thing is the migration and so on, but it talks about the entire scenario. And nothing much has changed, sadly, nothing much has changed. We are 2 years down the road, and as things altered for the people, I'm not talking about the privileged, we are all privileged. But for the most people, nothing has changed. People are stuck in their villages. Many of them haven't come back. Most people are out of jobs. Most professionals are half-time and out of jobs anyway. So, what are we even talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of a conversation I actually had just around this time a year ago with Danish Siddiqui, who was also out there every day capturing the stories of the migrants and using, photojournalism, but very conscious of storytelling, and the power of storytelling, to get this invisible, right? The invisible, the migrants almost became like the invisible enemy, right? They were like filled with contagion, even though they actually hadn't been the cause of any contagion at that point, and it was really coming in from very different sources, right? It was mostly the upper classes, who had been traveling to other locales, etc. So
no, it was politicized. Everything was, politicized. The caste question was brought in again. Hierarchies of such things were brought in again. And can you imagine? There was episodes which were reported that they were sprayed with bleach. It's just inhuman, the kinds of things all over the world. Of course, I mean our country, particularly, you see graphic things much more. But yeah, it's horrific. It's horrific. Which is why, I have to say that this book has been arranged in a way that the final message, if there can be any message, there is no message, one message from a book, but the tilt is towards hope and consolation, which is the second half of the book. For me, it's all about light. You have to focus on light, because if you're going to focus on the darkness, then you will be going to be consumed. There's no way you can get up every day because there's too much gloom and doom. But having said that, there's a lot of positivity also. You can see good sides of people, the kind of camaraderie, the social, community level help people are doing and all that. So there's that as well.
You talked about the hierarchies, the fissures, and the political kind of discord almost that manifested itself in very ugly ways in this particular crisis, and in any crisis, right? That can happen. But the coronavirus pandemic also showed us positive facets of the global, as you pointed out, in terms of sharing and collaboration, whether it's scientists working together for a cure or artists creating poignant works. How have you, Sudeep, encountered the global, both in the themes of your writing and in your broader literary practice?
I'm glad you asked that, because, again, these are the beauties of, working in the artistic field. A lot of it sometimes is spontaneous and accidental. So one of the early reviews and interviews that happened when the book came out, the book is going to come out in America in January, and in the UK edition is going to come out on the 2nd of December, but in India, it's already out for a few months. One of the first organizations to contact me was the Norwegian Climate Change Agency and the Literary Society there. I was just so thrilled and not stunned, but really thrilled that a literature book, a literary book, crossed over in that sort of sense, because that's really, I don't write poetry or books for the academy or for the English literature students or for professors. I actually write for everybody. Hopefully, anybody who's interested in, which is why it's a challenge to make poetry both complex, but at the same time accessible. It's a real art to do that. So the way the global part reached out to me was beautiful. So for instance, there's a songwriter, musician called Heather Shepard in America. She's, done 10 albums, and she and her husband have a band, and she's now engaging with Anthropocene. She's making an album of my poetry, and 3 of the songs have been done. I've not met her yet. We saw each other on Zoom finally on a similar program, because I said, why don't we play 2 of the songs on the program so that she can talk about how she encountered it. In the artistic world, that's happened as well. I remember the book has been sent out for reviews many places, and the Week magazine in the South, they wrote to me saying that we are not going to be sending it to a literary critic, but we are going to ask this science reporter to write on it. So, that's very, very fulfilling. I come from a tradition where, it was much more open-ended. It's a Bengali family. I was a pure science student. I was going to be an architect or a physicist. Mm-hmm. That's what I was studying. So, but in a sense, it was helpful because the science background helps me to write about that aspect of life in a much more organic and knowledgeable way, which otherwise wouldn't have been the case. Just to give you a small example, I remember as an undergrad, we were being taught the metaphysical poets, John Donne, The Sun Rising, and that poem, Compass. Mm-hmm. And, the professors talked about the sort of literary aspects of it and what was going on. But actually the poet wrote the poem simply because he peered through Galileo's first telescope, and his vision of the cosmos changed. And that's what prompts the poem. Nobody really talking about the genesis of the poem. So that aspect never got discussed. We talked about the nuances of language and the complexities of structure, which is all very interesting. But the fundamental basis was never done. So
absolutely. I mean, I think you pointed to something that we are also very conscious of, is looking at an issue, and particularly something like, the coronavirus. I mean, you cannot think of, solid borders and boundaries, much as we've been limited in our own hyperlocality because of the, the kind of lockdowns and the obstacles to mobility. At the same time, the consciousness and the desire to connect is very, very strong. And I think as we look at pedagogy, from the perspective of addressing problems or addressing, new eras or new epochs, I do think that the interdisciplinarity that you spoke about, is really, really important, and I think particularly in the case of climate change, this is really well demonstrated now, right? So
no, yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think, in a climate change conference, they should invite filmmakers and artists and writers too. It's not just about bureaucrats and scientists. I mean, that's when it's going to change really. And young people, of course, young people have taken it upon themselves. Greta Thunberg being, the obvious example. And it's terrible. We are leaving a world for our children which is completely not fair. What have they done? Nothing, to inherit this sort of thing. But, also while during the pandemic, another beautiful thing happened that, in writing, you have these wonderful metaphors which keep recurring through the book. And I have this beautiful neem tree outside my house. And for me, the neem tree suddenly, because I look at it every day, and during the lockdown, I was even looking at it even closely because, there were more birds and more caterpillars, and I was seeing it in a kind of a microwave. The neem tree outside my house became a central metaphor in the book. But it's interesting how the hyper-local can also become a metaphor for something very, very large. And there are several poems in the book which allude to the neem tree. And my friends, of course, all want to come and see the neem tree.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to, so your friends, is this the circle of poets? I mean, just in terms of the business or the industry, you've published at this time where the publishing industry is supposedly in a lot of crisis, right? So can you tell us about publishing in this time? One, what were some of the challenges that you're facing or that you faced? And two, just in terms of the circle of poets and writers, I mean, what kind of, interactions do you have with each other, and how do you keep it going? And is there more exchange? Is there more kind of collaboration? What other formats do you have these, do you have, online meetings or Zoom meetings where you're reading each other's work to each other, not necessary for an audience that, outside, but just for each other?
So all of that, yes, all of that happens, has happened. I don't necessarily take part in all of that because this time is a constraint, and I actually prefer reading and writing in solitude more than appearing for programs. So publishing, coming back to publishing, the major publishers had cut their list down by 70%. So in a sense, I feel very, very lucky that the book came out in the kind of doom and gloom time of publishing. I suspect part of it was just the topicality of the book, I mean, that of course helped. I was working on something else. I didn't plan to write Anthropocene as such. Climate change is a topic I've been writing about for a long time. I've written a book called Rain, Distracted Geography. So it's always been there. But this wasn't a book that I was planning to write. It just happened that, there was enough to make it into a book. The book I was really working on has been shelved to next year, which I'm very passionate about. It's called The Whispering Anklet, or Pile, I'm obsessed with classical Indian dance and Western dance. So it's my 35, 40 years of obsession with classical dance. So I feel very, very lucky that, the book came out. And also the fact that, there was a lot of attention because most of the newspapers have cut down their books pages and, and no literature festival. So all those were frustrating things, because slowly things are opening up. I think there are hybrid things that are happening. But it's a reality. It's the way we've treated our world. It's a reality, so we deserve it in a way. It's telling us. The Earth is telling us. The planet is telling us that you guys behave. Otherwise, you'll be wiped out.
Yeah. The American Academy of Poets observes that the poetic form is perfectly suited to social media-driven, a social media-driven mobile culture that enables people to share more freely and allows poets to have access to mass platforms and become their own champions. Statistics from the UK show that in 2018, poetry sales were already increasing year by year, and significantly more than 40% of the buyers were less than 34 years old, something that the writers of the study attributed to a growing number of political millennials who were looking to process complex and difficult emotions in an uncertain climate. In India, spoken word poetry sharing works through social media, poetry workshops, and other platforms for the consumption and spread of poetry have picked up, at least in urban centers. So how do you see this upswing in the popularity of poetry playing out in the long term? Will it translate to more poetry being published and platformed?
This is the golden question. Poets would love it if the answer to your last part of the question was, will more poetry be published? Unfortunately, the publishing industry is such that it is very, very difficult to publish poetry. The mainstream publishers only do 1 or 2 poetry books a year, if at all. Many don't even touch poetry. So at that level, it's very difficult. It has always been difficult. There is the other side, which I want to talk about, which is, there's no quality control. Because, you can have a Zoom account and you can start broadcasting and everybody's, I'll just give you a small example. You can write a poem. You're sad tonight and you write a poem and you post it. Tomorrow morning, you get 5 likes. The 6th one is from Uzbekistan. And the person really starts believing that they're internationally acclaimed. I see that all the time in social media. But the serious stuff is really, fairly traditional. You have to buy the book and read it. How can you really enjoy poetry reading PDFs and Kindle? No.
Sudeep, will you read your poem That Is then?
Yes. It's a tiny little poem which opens the book, and it's dedicated to my son Arya. And when I send the poem to him, of course, children, they say, "Oh, another poem like that," So he told me that, "Baba, it's actually really beautiful, but I don't understand it. What is it about?" But sometimes I think the magic of not knowing should be there. And this is what the poem is. Sometimes I also feel, did I really write it? But it's something that I couldn't throw away. And people love it. It's just been, So then I thought, let me just put it right in front of the book, partly because I was biased. It's for my son. It's for him. And so it's called That Is, and it's spelled I.E. as in that is. That is because you hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf. You hear the sea. That is because I consider the sea silent. You hear its silence in my studio. That is, and because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. And this poem has actually been made into this beautiful song by Heather Shepherd. There's a little poem film which people can see on my YouTube channel. beautifully lyrical, It's another interpretation of the same poem. But there we are. And, it's about hope. I want to just read out 3 lines from the book ends with this quotation from this wonderful Polish poet called Czesław Miłosz. And I quote, "My generation was lost, cities too, and nations. But all this a little later. Meanwhile, in the window, a swallow." So amid all this, they're all there. You just have to look for it,
Well, hopefully, Sudeep, with this younger generation, at least taking to some forms of poetry, hopefully that will lead to a more contemplative, interrogation and enjoyment of the longer forms as well. Can you share something for aspiring poets, and what would be a message that you could share with them?
I'll just say the boring old thing which my gurus have taught me is to just read voraciously and write every day. There's this misnomer with poetry that poetry should only be written when you're struck with Indra's lightning, or you fall deeply in love, or you're heartbroken, or something huge happens. The unglamorous side of poetry is you just have to sit down and write. I spend 2 hours every day with poetry. So my 2 hours, I would say, just to give an example, we are all busy, we've got lives and so on. For me, those 2 hours could be, I wish I can write a new poem every day for 2 hours. That'll be fabulous, but of course it's not possible. So how do I spend this 2 hours? I'll read someone else's book of poetry, I'll critique, I write for newspapers and magazines on poetry, book reviews, so I might use that time. And it's not necessarily that it's the same 2 hours. I could take an hour in the morning or my lunchtime, or, it's just my way of keeping connected with poetry. It's like the classical singers, they have to do their riyaz. You have to do your practice and riyaz. Without the rigor, you're not going to be, you can't last. So when I'm teaching poetry, I always said, why don't you write a sonnet or a sestina or a canzone or a ghazal? And of course, the young students, the millennials will say, but this is such old fashioned. What's the point? I said, the point is very simple. These are difficult forms to master. Try them, just see how difficult they are. And once you master form, it's easy to break forms. The same thing with poetry. You can write your free verse and your fragmented verse. I've talked about Disembodied, it was a conscious decision. But then you know what you're breaking, what kind of tradition you're breaking, and making something anew. You can't make something anew if you don't know the tradition. For instance, the poem, there's a poem called Bharatanatyam Dancer I wrote. And the poem, each stanza has 6 or 7 lines. And so the beat the dancer was dancing on the stage was ta dhinta, tai thaita, ta dhinta, tai thaita. So by the time I came to the 3rd or 4th or 5th or 6th or 7th draft, the poem started very differently. And I said, why can't I recreate this rhyme scheme in English? So it became A-B-A-C-C-A, 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 ta dhinta, tai thaita, the new form that was invented. There's a very, very old poem I wrote called The New York Times, which is 5 lines in each stanza. And the rhyme scheme is A, B, X, B, A. The middle line, the 3rd line, the X line acts as a mirror line, which reflects the top 2. And the reason that's the case is if you turn the poem on its axis and have the mirror line in the middle, then the shape of the poem reflects the towers of Manhattan and its reflection on the water. Each stanza also sort of has the shape of Manhattan. So these were, all kinds of things can be done once you have mastered, the basic grammar and syntax and form. That's why I think I keep telling people that you may not use it at all. It's like learning Sanskrit or Latin, which we had to do, which painfully, did we like it? Most of the time we didn't, Did we like learning the multiplication tables? No, of course we didn't. But thank God we did. So that's really it. Read your colleagues, read your colleagues, not just your own poems. So read voraciously, write every day. Easy.
Thanks, Sudeep. I'm going to take a couple of questions that have been posed on, to us from our audience members. So Shika Upadhyay writes, women see climate change and ecology, and their perspective and relationship all could be very different. And similarly, in the pandemic, the way it impacted women and men was also very different. So how do you ensure as a poet that your voice is relatable to the experience of women as well?
So, very good question. I mean, for me, the gender aspect doesn't really enter my poetry in that kind of separated way. I'm much more of a humanist. So whenever I'm writing, I forget whether I'm writing for a woman or a man or a child or an adult. It's really about humanity. So even though I might be writing about, if it's a topic that sort of talks more about women, it should be, for me, this is my personal prescription, of course, it should be written in a way that it's accessible and makes sense to all sorts of genders, including in between genders. We can't just have a traditional sort of boxed view of that. So that's not an issue for me because my mind is wired in a way that, I don't even separate this man-woman, not man-woman thing at all, It's the bone structure, the heart, the mind, the skin, the intellect is what forms. To me, in the writing, it should really be, as far as possible, equal and addresses both, if not more. So that's the way I do it. I'm not saying I'm successful all the time, but certainly that's the endeavor.
Mamita Chaudhary asks, she talks about, time and space are really affected by, the political and theoretical discourse on the Anthropocene, right? So that the Anthropocene affects our understanding of time and space. And so as a poet, how did you negotiate, the existing poetic form and language to deal with time and space to address what's happening to them under climate change?
So a good example was the first poem I read out, just trying different things on the page to reflect the visual mapping of what's happening. There's a poem called Rising Sea Levels, which is sort of shaped in a particular way. So it sort of shows how the oceans are eating into the land. And, the other alarming thing is a lot of the coastal cities, I don't know exactly the statistics, will be underwater after a certain point. They'll all be gone. So yes, if you're using larger macrocosmic structures, which I do, and very, very basic syntactical tools, then you can talk about time and space, whatever happens. So you can shift the geography and the terrain, but you still have the tools to engage and write about it quite easily. It's like, with a certain kind of education, say you and I have had. I've grown up in India. I've had a completely Indian education to start with. 3 languages, not unusual for any Indian, maybe more. So when we are first transplanted into a sort of Western space, a simple, probably well-meaning question, how do you speak English so well? I said, well, so do you. If I started speaking Bangla, then we won't have a conversation. So in a way, we are very, very lucky that we are always constantly living between the ancient, medieval, and the modern, and the postmodern. At the same time, we have so many different traditions that we draw upon linguistically and culturally and artistically otherwise, that we are very lucky, I think, as Indians, or many people from South Asia or the East or Iran or, certain older cultures, that we have those larger tools So if we are talking about desertscape, we can use the same tool and talk about it. And if you're talking about floods, we can talk about it because we have the form and the theoretical construct intact. And a history and a sense of rich history. It's wonderful. We can just dip into it and in and out of anything. You're just so privileged being from this part of the world.
On that note,
it's a good question.
On that note, Sudeep, we are over time, but I didn't want to stop talking. I would say that we've really been enriched by this conversation with you, and we've learned so much. And I can't wait for you to come actually, to the center, which is also yours as an alumnus. And thank you for joining us. And I'll see you at the next event. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Raveena, for all the lovely question and hard work, and your team. I mean, I must say that you guys are so wonderfully well prepared. When coming back to Colombia, it seems like, the blue color is lovely to see again.